History isn't made of smooth moments and calm diplomatic decisions. It's forged in chaos, in the clash of ambitions, and in the fall of giants. And if there's one battle that shaped the fate of Rome, it was Actium. It wasn't just a naval conflict. It was the showdown that destroyed one era and ushered in another. On one side stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, two of antiquity's most fascinating figures. On the other, Octavian, a cold and calculating strategist determined to become the most powerful man in the world. And in the midst of it all, a sea teeming, with ships ready to decide the future of the West. But the question no one asks is, was this battle already lost before the first ship even set sail? While history books recount the outcome as inevitable, the truth is that Mark Antony's luck began to turn well before the first blow was struck. Octavian didn't win merely because he had a stronger army. He won because he understood the game better than anyone else. The sea wasn't just the battlefield, it was the perfect trap. And when we speak of Actium, we're not just talking about war. We're talking about the end of the Roman Republic, the birth of the empire, and one of the greatest acts of betrayal and despair ever recorded. How did Cleopatra manage to turn her back on the man who promised her everything? Why did Mark Antony, one of Rome's most brilliant generals, make the worst decision of his life? And how did a young man named Octavian become the undisputed master of Rome without ever having to lift a sword? If you think Rome's history is all about legions and bloody battles, get ready to see the more human and tragic side of this event. This is the story of a love that destroyed empires, of a leader who squandered his own destiny, and of a victory that defined the world for centuries to come. The Battle of Actium was more than a naval confrontation. It was the turning point of Western civilization. And when the first ship was set ablaze in the Ionian Sea, the world was never the same again. Rome lived under a tension that went far beyond politics. It was a true game of chess, where every move could change the fate of the Republic. At the center of this board were Mark Antony and Octavian, two powerful men who had once been allies, but whose bond was now shattered. The triumvirate that had once united these giants was falling apart, and war was only a matter of time. And as is always the case in history, it wasn't just about power, but also about influence, loyalty, and, of course, love. And it was precisely that last element that ignited the spark for the inevitable confrontation. Mark Antony wasn't just a brilliant general. He was a man driven by intense passions, and none was greater than his love for Cleopatra. The Queen of Egypt wasn't merely a pawn in the game, she was a player. By allying herself with Antony, she sought to secure Egypt's sovereignty in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. But in Rome, this relationship was seen as an insult, a sign of treason. Octavian knew how to use that perception to his advantage, portraying Mark Antony as a man corrupted by Eastern luxuries, estranged from Roman ideals. The Senate was convinced this was no longer a conflict between generals, but a fight for the soul of Rome. The clash between the two leaders didn't happen overnight. The tension was built up gradually, with the pieces slowly falling into place. On one side, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were gathering their forces in Egypt, preparing for what was to come. On the other, Octavian, cunning and patient, was consolidating his position, securing support, and strengthening his navy. Deep down, both knew that a direct land confrontation could drag on for years. The decision would be made at sea, and that's where Octavian had a trump card, his brilliant admiral, Agrippa. While Mark Antony trusted in the grandeur of his fleet, Octavian relied on strategic intelligence. War wasn't just a matter of brute strength, it required a sharp mind. The impending conflict wasn't a simple naval skirmish. It was the watershed moment in Roman history. The Republic hung by a thread, and the outcome of this battle would define the future of the world. But before Actium, before the final decision, there was one crucial detail. How did the two fleets compare? What did each side bring to the battlefield? On one side, Mark Antony and Cleopatra assembled an imposing fleet worthy of a spectacle. Their ships were giants, true floating fortresses with reinforced hulls and combat towers that elevated the soldiers above the sea level. A truly daunting sight, no doubt, but Rome had already learned a valuable lesson from Carthage. At sea, size isn't always an advantage. Octavian and his strategist, Agrippa, knew this. They also knew that victory in war wasn't achieved solely through might, but through cunning. Octavian's fleet was smaller, but it possessed an invisible weapon: speed. His ships were more agile, designed for quick maneuvers and precise strikes. Moreover, his sailors were experienced, trained to face larger vessels without being intimidated. In Rome, discipline was a weapon in itself. There was no room for error. Every stroke, every command, every move was calculated to overcome the grandeur of the opposing fleet. And of course, there was Agrippa, the man who would transform the sea into a battleground favorable to the Romans. If the duel had been decided solely by visual impact, Mark Antony would have already won. His fleet carried the symbolic weight of the East, with Cleopatra shouldering much of the endeavor. The Egyptians knew how to build impressive ships, and those at Actium were nothing short of awe-inspiring. But impressing and winning are two very different things. The enormous ships were slow, difficult to maneuver, and relied on a favorable wind to execute their most effective moves. And at sea, when you lose control, you lose everything. Agrippa noticed this weakness and devised a plan to turn Antony's advantage into a trap. Instead of confronting the enemy ships head-on, as traditional combat would suggest, he bet on mobility. The strategy was clear: isolate, wear down, and attack. While Antony's massive ships struggled to get organized, Octavian's nimble boats danced around them, slicing through their formations. It was a clash of styles, the brute force versus agility, strength versus cunning. And then, as if Actium were a chessboard, Agrippa made the first move. But it wasn't with cannons, arrows, or swords. It was with something even more lethal: a blockade. If Mark Antony didn't quickly grasp what was happening, his fleet would be left without supplies, trapped in treacherous waters. And believe me, nothing scares a commander more than knowing that time and the sea are against him. But did he realize it in time? Agrippa wasn't just a talented admiral. He was a relentless strategist, someone who understood that winning a war began long before the battle itself. Instead of facing Mark Antony directly, he used time as his weapon. With a calculated blockade, he cut off the supplies coming from Greece to resupply the enemy fleet. It was like slowly tightening the noose around the adversary, not killing immediately, but making every day more suffocating. And Antony, caught between the sea and the land, began to feel the weight of that decision. The blockade wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Hungry soldiers fight poorly. Demoralized crews make mistakes. Mark Antony knew he had to act before his fleet lost all morale. The problem? His vessels were heavy, built for frontal combat rather than quick escapes or maneuvers. Time was on Octavian's side as he patiently waited for the enemy to weaken. A siege is like a game of patience, and Agrippa played with the calm of someone who already knew the ending. With few alternatives, Antony realized he'd be forced to fight at a disadvantage. The blockade left him no choice: either try to break through the encirclement or watch his fleet wither away until destroyed. To make matters worse, doubts were brewing within his own ranks. Many generals questioned whether facing Octavian at that moment was the best decision. Cleopatra, ever shrewd, began to weigh the risks. The game of politics was cruel, and fragile alliances tend to collapse at the first sign of trouble. Octavian, on the other hand, was in no hurry. The longer Antony remained trapped, the better it was for Rome. The siege tightened, and any rash move by the enemy would only pave the way for an easier victory. Agrippa's strategy was a masterclass in military. Patience forced the adversary to act without thinking. The perfect battlefield isn't the one where you fight, but the one where the enemy has no choice but to fight on your terms. And that's exactly what happened. Cornered, Mark Antony decided to break the blockade and take his fleet out to open sea, where at least he'd have a fighting chance. The problem? That was precisely the scenario Octavian and Agrippa had been waiting for. And the moment the sails were hoisted and the oars began to churn the water, the Battle of Actium officially began. But was Mark Antony truly ready for what was to come? Then the sea turned into a war zone. Mark Antony's fleet advanced like a heavy giant, relying on brute strength. His imposing reinforced ships were ready to crush anything that dared cross their path. But on the other side, Octavian and Agrippa had a different approach. They weren't going to charge head-on into Antony's floating fortress, not when they could dance around it and strike at its weakest points. And that's exactly what they did. Octavian's smaller, more agile ships began to spread out, surrounding the massive enemy triremes. With quick and precise maneuvers, they attacked blind spots, setting vessels ablaze and cutting oars in half. Mark Antony tried to react, but his wooden giants were just too sluggish. Every attempt at regrouping was thwarted by fresh attacks. At sea, a fraction of a second makes all the difference, and Octavian's fleet was always one step ahead. Soon, the waves were littered with wreckage, while the scent of burning wood and incendiary oil filled the air. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and Antony's soldiers were beginning to realize what was already evident. They were at a disadvantage. The ships that weren't destroyed drifted aimlessly, without command, waiting for the inevitable. But war always has an unpredictable element, the human factor. And it was at this critical moment that something unexpected happened. In the midst of the clash, a maneuver caught everyone's attention. Cleopatra's ships, which had been positioned in the rear, suddenly began to pull away. The Queen of Egypt, seeing that the tide wasn't turning in her favor, decided it wasn't worth staying to witness the end. With her fleet intact, she set sail with the wind at her back and departed. It was a harsh blow to Antony, who saw his principal ally abandon the fight without warning. But what he did next was even more surprising. Faced with Cleopatra's flight, Mark Antony made the toughest decision of his life. He abandoned the battle and went after her. His army, his fleet, his men, everyone was left behind at the mercy of Octavian's forces. A commander who abandons the battlefield seals the fate of his soldiers. And that's exactly what happened. Those left behind, without leadership and hope, had no choice but to surrender or die. But this wasn't just the defeat of a general. It was the beginning of the end of an era, and that's how everything fell apart. The moment Cleopatra turned her sails to the wind, Mark Antony's fate was sealed. No one knows exactly what went through his mind at that moment. But one thing is certain, he didn't hesitate. He left everything behind and followed the Queen of Egypt, abandoning his fleet to its fate. For the soldiers who remained, the message was clear. There was no longer any hope. What once was an army had become nothing more than a group of men, surrounded, waiting for the final blow. Cleopatra's flight wasn't just an isolated event, it was the spark that ignited the collapse. Without leadership or direction, the remaining ships on the battlefield were either annihilated or captured. Octavian wasted no time. His fleet, disciplined and meticulously organized, finished off what was left of the opposition. Antony's soldiers, with no alternatives, began to surrender en masse. One by one, the enemy's standards fell, while Rome, as ruthless as ever, turned Actium into a naval cemetery. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, now fugitives, returned to Egypt, but the air was already heavy. They were no longer the powerful rulers of Old, they were survivors of a lost battle, ghosts of a war they could no longer win. With each passing day, their options dwindled. Octavian, methodical and relentless, would give them no respite. His victory was absolute, and the hunt had already begun. The world Antony knew was crumbling before his eyes. In Egypt, Cleopatra tried to do what she did best: negotiate, manipulate, and find a political way out. But against Octavian, these maneuvers had little effect. He wasn't a man swayed by passion or empty promises. He wanted Egypt. He wanted complete victory. He was determined to ensure there would never be a second chance for his enemies. And for that, he had to make sure that Mark Antony and Cleopatra no longer posed any threat. And so, isolated and without hope, the two lovers made their final decision. Antony, devastated and humiliated, fell upon his own sword. Cleopatra, aware that she would be paraded as a trophy in Rome, chose to die with dignity, or at least in the manner that legends recount. But as their lives drew to a close, the Roman world was undergoing an irreversible transformation. The stage was set for Octavian's rise, and with it, the birth of something that would change history forever. With his victory at Actium, Octavian not only defeated Mark Antony, he eliminated the last obstacle between himself and absolute control over Rome. The Republic, which for centuries had balanced between ambitious senators and power-hungry generals, was reaching its final chapter. The Senate, cornered and with no alternatives, was forced to acknowledge the inevitable. Rome needed a strong leader, someone who could bring stability after years of civil war. And that leader was Octavian. But he wasn't foolish. He knew that the Romans wouldn't accept a king. So he did something brilliant. He assumed all the power without it looking like he was doing so. He created titles such as princeps, first among citizens, and maintained the appearance of a functioning republic. But in practice, he controlled everything: army, politics, economy. Rome was still called a republic, yet it lived under an empire. And with one important detail: now there was only one man in command. The name Octavian was soon left behind. In 27 BC, the Senate granted him a new title befitting his position, Augustus. And with that, the first Roman emperor was born. It was no longer the old Rome of consuls and tribunes. It was now an empire with an absolute leader. The institutions still existed, but they served a single purpose: to keep Augustus in power. And so, almost imperceptibly, Rome took a leap that would change its history forever. The transformation wasn't just political. Under Augustus, Rome strengthened, its borders expanded, and an era of relative peace began. This period would come to be known as the Pax Romana, a time of prosperity and order. For many, it was proof that the empire was the inevitable destiny of Roman civilization. For others, it marked the end of republican freedom. But one thing was undeniable. Actium was the event that set it all in motion. The ancient world would never be the same again. Egypt became a Roman province, Cleopatra became a legend, and Mark Antony a mere footnote in the history of the man who triumphed. Rome now belonged to Augustus, and his influence would extend for centuries. But did absolute power truly bring stability? Or did it merely plant the seeds of new intrigues and betrayals that would arise in the future? The story of the Battle of Actium teaches us a brutal truth. Destiny favors strategists, not just warriors. Mark Antony had strength, Cleopatra had influence, but Octavian possessed something even more valuable: patience and long-term vision. In the end, the victor wasn't the one who was mightiest on the battlefield, but the one who knew how to play his pieces even before the fight began. And the lingering question is, how many battles have you already lost without realizing that the war began long before? The fall of Antony and Cleopatra wasn't just the end of a legendary couple. It was a warning that impulsive decisions and fragile alliances can destroy even the greatest of empires. How many times in your life have you followed a path driven by emotion without seeing the whole board? How many opportunities have slipped away because you clung to a dead-end plan? History always rewards those who learn from the mistakes of others. Rome became an empire because Octavian knew how to forge his own destiny. And you? Are you just letting the wind carry your boat? Or do you really have a strategy? If you want to master your own history, you need to think like the great leaders of antiquity, with intelligence, cool-headedness, and vision. Because at the end of the day, life isn't much different from Actium. Either you control the game, or you become just another name lost in the waves of time. Now tell me, what lessons do you take from this story? What can Actium teach you about your own daily battles? Leave a comment below, because this conversation isn't over yet. And of course, if you want to keep exploring the secrets of history and understand how past events shape the present, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. History waits for no one, and you won't want to miss what comes next.